One of the things, it seems to me, that afflicts a lot of congregations in their conversations about worship is this thing that I call like a Camelot mentality. And so I see this sometimes in very, very traditionalist churches where there's this attitude of, well, there was this period in the Reformation where they got everything right when it came to worship, and we have to get back to that.
Yeah.
Or sometimes even in evangelical churches, you hear people talk that way about the early church. They say, well, the early church did it this way, so this is how we should do it. Or in my own congregation, we hear this sometimes with the 1970s. We say, you know, in the 1970s, when I became a Christian, this is what was happening, and this is what we need to do.
Right.
And it's something, it's fundamentally, I think, kind of based in a lack of faith, like not believing that the Holy Spirit is at work right now, and that the Holy Spirit is still capable of bringing about these experiences and revivals that we don't even have a vision for. But one of the things, one of the particular kinds of idolatries that I feel like I see in a lot of young churches especially is actually this sort of idolatry of youth culture. That is to look at the particular, best way to say this, that I see congregations where there is such an attachment to all of the entrapments of youth in America, whether that's the sort of fashion entrapments and this sort of fundamental belief that we're not going to get old, you know, or that we can, you know, that we can be both old and young at the same time. And that there's this sort of hamster wheel that churches can get into of always needing to be fresher, of the worship needing to be the next new thing. And I'll give you an example of this. That I was at sort of a worship event several months ago, and out in the lobby, there were these giant posters up, and these giant posters was like, they were a close-up of this particular church musician's face, and it had a caption on it that said, "Can this person change the way that the church worships?" You know, and you see that sort of celebrity culture, the way that's permeated the way that we think about worship, and how much of a need there actually is for us right in the middle of that, in the middle of our worship, to actually challenge those kinds of idolatries. And like we've been talking about with hymns, actually saying to people, no, we are going to actually die, and that one of the things that we do in our worship is prepare people to die well, rather than try to tell people they can be old and young at the same time.
That's right. Yeah, no, I think, I was thinking, like, I think that's one of the things that's so valuable about the hymns is that they remind us, almost in every hymn, the last verse is about death and what this truth will be in that context, and it's important for people to sing that in a regular way. I mean, I live in Nashville, Tennessee, right? So I think, you know, one of the things that fits into this is worship music as an industry, as a business. I mean, the Christian music business is dying. It's dying. The Gospel Music Association didn't even have their convention this past year, right? But worship artists, an idea I'm very uncomfortable with, is one of the only segments that's making any money. And so, like, I've found in interactions we've had with Christian record companies at times, like, they can only really think in a business model that makes an artist and then sells product through that artist. I think that's deeply troubling, and it has some really troubling implications for the church. I mean, it's one of my concerns about celebrity preachers on video too. I mean, I know we might have different views on that, but I think it's another way that contributes to that. And what I see working with college students is that people don't feel encouraged to use their gifts unless they're at this level of professionalism, and it's so damaging, it's so destructive. And
well, not even just professionalism. It's a level of, like, you have to look the part, you have to dress the part, you have to sound a certain way and inflect a certain way, and it's again, it has nothing to do with a local congregation. It has everything to do with this machine that's being driven, you know, that's being driven in Nashville.
You know, I'll give you a real practical example of it. When I started working for the church where I work in Virginia, I sort of saw this right away, we looked at our whole worship volunteer structure, and it really felt like, wow, all of the people that are leading us in worship are between about 25 and 36, you know, it's sort of that demographic. And yet we look around our congregation, we have all of these children. We don't have a really meaningful children's music program. We look around our congregation, we have all these older members. And then not only that, but we you know, we look at our roster and we see a whole segment of people in our membership roles that are in nursing homes. And so one of the things that we said right away, within the first year of our church's worship ministry, was to say, we're going to actively start recruiting people to be involved with our worship program that are not in that little demographic. And we're going to actually require people that do want to lead in worship to maybe get a little sense of how leading worship is not, sorry, I'm saying this wrong, that trying to encourage our church musicians to get outside of that onstage experience of being in front of everybody with microphones and actually saying part of being a worship leader is going to be that you're going to work with the children, and part of being a worship leader is going to be that we go and we lead worship in nursing homes. Because fundamentally, I think a lot of church musicians don't see themselves so much as servants as much as they see themselves as artists. And I think as long as the artist mentality is not tempered by the servant mentality, that we're going to continue to have this sort of spiraling celebrity culture in worship.
You know, it's interesting, like 2 of the churches in Nashville I know that have been the most attractive to artists have been churches where the musicians are not at the front.
Right.
Well, there's an Anglican church that the musicians are in the back, so you never see them. They're in the balcony in such a way that if you're in the congregation, you can't even tell where they are.
Right.
And so many musicians that I know love that because they're trying to have a different experience than their job experience where they're the focus, right? Now, I still think there's a place for me, like artists and musicians, sort of the baggage they bring to the task of leading worship is feeling like it's more spiritual to be invisible.
Right.
And one of the ways they need to serve is actually to lead. But it's been very interesting. And the church where I'm at now, we started, just because of space, the way the room was configured, the musicians were on the floor, down on the side. And again, once you stood up, nobody could see them. Right. And it was amazing to me how many times I'd have conversations with musicians that said, I can envision myself being there and wanting to be there, and I want to be part of this church because I'm not the focus.
Right.
And it's fascinating because they're all sort of in this culture and this business and this industry that says, no, you're the focus and we have to make you a celebrity so that everybody feels like whatever you want and whatever you like is what's good for us.
Right. I mean, one of the things that I actually push up against a lot in our own congregation and other conversations, I don't know if this is going to catch on or not, but I'm always urging people involved in church music to think of themselves as church musicians, more so than even the phrase worship leader. And the reason I know this is a dicey subject, but at our church what we do is the pastor, the person actually leading in prayers, that person we refer to as the worship leader, the person actually leading us through the liturgy is the worship leader. And I really try to instill in our church musicians, we are church musicians. We are servants of the church. And what we are here for is to take all of these gifts that God has given us, gifts of creativity, and actually to serve the church with them. And that sometimes that means making something that we are so excited about making something that's really, that we feel like is really beautiful. And sometimes it means actually laying down the thing that we're excited about making and serving our brothers and sisters with it.
And you know, one of the things that comes to mind in this is sort of that paradigm that worship leaders talk about all the time, or that tension between performance and worship. You know, like, well, if you're performing, then you're not worshiping; it's about you. Or if you're worshiping, you're not performing because it's about God, which is kind of a false dichotomy. But one of the things that comes to mind to me, thinking about that, is that the reality of being a servant. Like if being a servant is a priority, it kind of pulls together those two tensions. Because being a servant calls for excellence. It calls for great performances. Like, execute your task as a worship leader, as a church musician, well. Do it. Execute that task well and beautifully, so that the church is brought together, so that the affections are stirred, so that the text is presented properly, all of that. And do so in such a way that you're a servant, and excellence as a servant, I think, is such a key thing. Mike Card had that book a few years ago, Scribbling in the Sand, and which was a book he wrote to artists. And the paradigm, he says, the way artists should think of themselves as using their gifts to wash people's feet. And we that's a phrase we use over and over and over again at Sojourn. It's like, let's use our gifts to wash people's feet. And I'm really thankful. I mean, I've played in a lot of churches and a lot of bands and a lot of different scenarios over the years. And every time I step outside of Sojourn and work with other musicians, I'm reminded of like the gift that I've been able to experience as a pastor at Sojourn, in that there really is a culture where people are showing up ready to serve. And it's not like they're showing up ready to serve and like we're not having fun and we're not playing fun music and engaging. Like it's a joyful experience for me as a musician to be a part of. And yet there's this humility that I feel like has pervaded the culture that exists because when we gather, we're reminding it over and over again through the liturgy, through the conversations that are happening, through the sermons, through the fact that every service, culminates with the Lord's Supper. That like this is not about us. This is about the cross. This is about the gospel. This is about Jesus' blood being shed for the sake of His church, and I just think when you're pounding that table, when you're hitting that note week after week after week, it's kind of hard to be walking out on the platform going, well, how's my hair?
Right.
Yeah. But the tragedy is so often those dots don't get connected.
Right.
I mean, I think it's one of the difficulties we face in working, in sort of this postmodern context is dots don't connect like they used to. And so it's possible. Well, I think it's possible to preach a gospel-centered message and yet undermine it with the songs you sing, and even with the sort of the things that you do in the church. For instance, there's this PBS Frontline documentary called The Merchants of Cool about how the media conglomerates manipulate young people through cool. And we've watched it a few times with my RUF students and then discussed it afterwards. And it's always fascinating because, as it says in the Proverbs, flattery is a snare. And it's the way advertising works in our day. After the remote control, you don't get shamed, you get flattered. So that you keep watching, you want to hear more, right? And what's fascinating is like, well, how can we begin to be a countercultural community? And one of my students said, it's really difficult when our churches only hire cool youth pastors because the leadership doesn't have the courage to say, that's not the most important thing. But if you hire somebody that's so disconnected from the culture, then you may be, making a great point, but nobody's there.
Yeah, I think you make a great point, Kevin, and it's similar to what you were saying a minute ago about the fact that there's this whole paradigm that exists of the music industry. This is how the music industry sells records, and that the worship music industry has kind of taken its cues from there. And one of the things that I think can be kind of discouraging sometimes about being in church music is how many conversations I have with people that really don't have a paradigm for what ought to be happening in a worship service.
That's right.
And so I feel like I feel like on the one hand, I'll be at a very informal church or something. And there is this very clear concert hall kind of paradigm where you walk in and the lights, blacken all the lights, and there's big lights on stage, and the stage is sort of elevated, and the music is maybe so loud that you could never even hear yourself sing, even if you did join in.
Right.
And it's clear that the church has sort of looked at this concert paradigm and said, okay, this works. People come to this, and I have a way of thinking about this, and we'll insert a sermon into there, and voila, that'll be church. And then on the other hand, I went to a Presbyterian school, and I've certainly, the whole time I was in college, was involved in a very conservative church. And that sometimes, like you say, in this attempt to be more removed from the world, that I feel like some churches can even adopt like a classroom, sort of a lecture hall model, where we just say, well, we're going to get rid of all beauty, all sort of emotion, any semblance of too much interaction with the culture. It's going to be more like a blank room, and there's going to be a couple songs at the very beginning, and then I'm going to lecture to you for 45 minutes. And it really seems like the Bible gives us this richer picture, and I love the language that Mike was just using about this richer picture of the worship service actually being a banquet hall, the worship service actually being a place where we come together around this table, many different kinds of people, that we actually share a meal with one another. And when you start to have that imagery, that this language of church musicians as servants starts to make a lot more sense. That being a servant, coming alongside this whole church community, gathered around these common songs, these songs that have a life in our community, and helping the church to actually share this meal together. That is such a more inspiring vision to me, and frankly a more biblical vision than this sort of concert hall, lecture hall model that a lot of churches feel like they're stuck with.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the encouraging things to me is I feel there's a growing movement coming against those two models, the lecture hall and the concert hall. Because I think what's happened tragically is people have depended on music to do things that it was never designed to do. Or they've depended on preaching alone to do this. It's fascinating to me how many of our preaching heroes, in sort of the way the history of the Reformed faith has been narrated to us, we think of them as merely preachers. But people like George Whitefield made a hymn book. Charles Spurgeon made a hymn book. J.C. Ryle, I have his hymn book at home. Philip Schaff. All of these people spent a lot of time, Calvin himself, a lot of time, a lot of effort to not just preaching, but to these other elements. And I'm finding so many people, and it's a really great thing. You mentioned you guys do weekly communion. We do it at our church as well. The interesting thing in my RUF context, our convictions about what should happen in that meeting is we don't do the sacraments in that context. And so I think it's made us even more depend on hymns that bring in the element of beauty and displaying Christ, because we don't have the Lord's Supper doing that in that context. But I think you're feeling God's stirring up a lot of people to say worship needs to be more holistic, because we're more than just, emotional, receptors to raise our hands and clap in a concert hall, and we're more than just brains. And worship needs to connect.
I think it is. I think it is and it isn't, because I think that for me, again, the way I was raised to think about worship, and first, like I said, I first started in this very sort of traditional thing and rebelled against that and found myself in this very sort of contemporary thing, and really what happened in both of those worlds was, what you were talking about, this concert hall, lecture hall thing, was I was taught to believe that you get together and you sing these songs and you create this emotional arc with music that gets people ready for the sermon. And then when, then you hit them hard with the sermon, and then you springboard off of the sermon into an even bigger emotional response and melt people down. Which was, that's a historically developed phenomenon. But I think it's so strong and it's so alive and well in our churches. I think there is some renewal of this idea that worship is not about this, blow your head off experience. There's some renewal of that. But for the most part, that's just the norm. And so people come to Sojourn and they experience, at Sojourn, again, we're sort of neo-liturgical, and they experience that, but still 9 out of 10 times, like my congregation loves the fact that we do this liturgical stuff because they experience it week after week after week. Most people who come in from the outside and experience it once go, I don't understand what you're doing, but can you tell me how to get a worship leader that can sing like Brooks Ritter?
So that's right.